Welcome ladies and gents, Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter, or of course you can subscribe to the channel Let's Talk Boxing. Let's talk about the heavyweight division and the big breaking news that the UFC's heavyweight champion of the world, Francis Ngannou, is potentially boxing bound, having been released from his UFC contract. Dana White gave an interview where he explained that Ngannou was made an offer to become the highest paid heavyweight in UFC's history, but following 2 years of negotiations, they could not agree personal terms, and that the UFC would never stand in the way of a fighter who doesn't want to be there. So they are not going to hold him hostage, and he will be allowed to leave and fight under any other organization's banner, or potentially even in another sport like boxing. He did come across very well in this interview, Dana White, but he did make a point about something which could be seriously significant to how we judge his potential fights moving forward if they are in the sport of boxing. It could be either a truthful statement, or it could be driven by a little psychological ploy from Dana White. So let's talk about it. He basically said that, in his opinion, Francis Ngannou was looking for a lot more money, but to fight lesser opposition. And that's not what the UFC's philosophy is about. He wants to see the best fighting the best. Now, that's potentially a true statement, because he also explains that Ngannou is currently weighing 300 pounds following some knee surgery that he still needs to recover from. If his body's breaking down a little bit, perhaps Ngannou's looking at this and thinking, you know what, I'm reaching the twilight of my career. I need to make as much money as I possibly can in this twilight in order to establish my future, my children's children. That could be the genuine motive. So we might have seen a guy who's lost his hunger. And if he has lost his hunger for glory, having achieved everything he could have dreamt of achieving with the UFC, well then maybe, even if he moves over to boxing, you're not going to see the same guy with the eye of the tiger. But there's another potential to this statement from Dana White, and it could just be an attempt to legitimize the next heavyweight champion of the UFC. When Muhammad Ali took a 3-year hiatus from the sport, in the meantime, Joe Frazier became the heavyweight champion, and a lot of fans were not accepting Joe as the legitimate heavyweight champ, until they then fought each other in a fight billed as the fight of the century. When Joe Frazier beat him, he was seen as the legitimate heavyweight champion. Prior to that, Smoking Joe wasn't getting the credit he deserved. So this could be a way of essentially portraying this as a guy who's lost that sharpness. I want you to consider this analogy. Let's say, for argument's sake, you have a king who has conquered the realm. He's taken the castle and all the crown jewels, and nobody's been able to come near him and take those crown jewels. Then he decides, I'm going to leave this place. I'm going to go and conquer other realms, other kingdoms, and I'm going to take all the crown jewels with me. He leaves the castle plundered and empty. Whoever comes in and takes that throne, he's not going to be considered the warrior king that overthrew the other king. He's going to be considered almost like a squatter, a guy that came in, the other king abandoned that castle. If he wanted to really come back and take it back, he could. In the meantime, this guy's just sitting on that throne, essentially, and he's going to have to try and find a way to build his own wealth, okay? But if that king, who was initially on the throne, saw that the armies were gathering on the horizon and he'd lost the taste for battle, and he was looking to claim riches without the challenge of those terrible wars and overcoming those encroaching armies, well then all of a sudden, as he flees and the other army rolls in and takes the throne, well then that new king is the true king. He's the true warrior king that has earned that throne because he's chased the other king away. You see the difference? So in order to legitimize the new king of the UFC, maybe that's what Dana White's trying to do here. So do we still see the hunger there? Are we going to see a Francis Ngannou who's looking to become a king in boxing? Well, one of the things we do know is that Francis Ngannou has been consulting a lot of boxing legends. He's been getting a few tidbits from Ryan Garcia, as well as, of course, Mike Tyson. Now, these are just general chit-chats where they're going over a few things and they're laughing and joking and stuff like that. But he's also spent some time with Teddy Atlas, who, of course, is a fantastic trainer who has a real history in boxing. And they were going over a number of technical elements in terms of how to set up his big power punches. And you know, Teddy has always said that he will only train guys that he really respects and likes as people. And that's why he trained Timothy Bradley. He said he was a champion, not just in the ring, but as a human being. And he seems to have a great relationship with Francis Ngannou as well. I think he would be fantastic in terms of fitting in with Francis Ngannou. He is a lovely guy. He comes across anyway as Francis. He comes across as humble. He almost has this Anthony Joshua thing about him, whereby when people are talking to him, you can see how locked in he is to what they're saying. He's seeking to absorb as much information as possible. So by consulting these boxing legends and being willing to learn in that way, could we see Ngannou step up and fight a guy like Tyson Fury, who he has been linked with? Well, the thing is, Teddy Atlas did make a statement just over a year ago where he said Francis Ngannou might not hit Fury before he gets hit because he's not in his realm. He's in the other guy's realm. Now, what is he trying to say there? Is he saying that Ngannou might not be able to compete with a Fury, but he can compete with the other guys? Bear in mind, he's worked with him a little bit here. Now, with the sort of punching power that Ngannou has, it's not always a guarantee that it will translate because you're wearing boxing gloves rather than mitts, so it's different in that regard. The way you set up that power is different because obviously in the UFC you have more things to worry about. You're more concerned about elbows, knees, kicks, potential grapples and takedowns. So as a result, it's easier to disguise a big punch potentially because your opponent has to focus on a whole bunch of other things. Whereas if he's only focusing on your 1 or 2 or 3 big shots in your arsenal, maybe it's easier to avoid those things, right? So there are certain things that we don't know yet how they'll translate. But from a physical perspective, it's fair to say that he carries a sort of power that could be effective. But would it be more prudent for him to heed the warnings of somebody like Teddy Atlas and go after lesser fighters, not necessarily elite fighters, not the Furies, the AJs, the Usyks, the Deontay Wilders, but maybe go after guys that we saw operate this weekend, for instance? Well, let's analyse some of these potential lesser guys that some people feel he should approach first before fighting the likes of Tyson Fury. We saw F.A. Ajagba outpoint Stephen Shaw. He won 96-94 on all the judges' scorecards. Now, F.A. Ajagba would be an African derby, right? He's Nigerian. You've got Francis Ngannou, who's from Cameroon. It would be something that would really capture the African continent, and not just the African continent, of course. The whole world would be interested in this fight because F.A. Ajagba is a big puncher himself, and he's a little bit stiff himself. He's not the most evasive of guys. So when you just consider it from that basic perspective, you start to say, well, what if? What if Ajagba isn't as evasive? And what if he does get caught by some big Ngannou shots? Could we see him take him out? And that creates an element of interest. Despite those criticisms, though, we are comparing him compared to other elite level heavyweights. He's still a boxer, and he's a decorated amateur at that. This is a guy who's a bronze medalist at the Commonwealth Games in 2014. A year later, he won gold at the African Games. He's 6'6", and his reach is as long as Tyson Fury's. He's got a big right hand. Last night against Stephen Shaw, he struggled early on with the movement of Shaw. To me, Ajagba still looks a little bit mentally scarred from the defeat at the hands of Frank Sanchez. And of course, you're never going to get somebody like Ngannou moving as well as Frank Sanchez. But nonetheless, the emotional and mental scars are still there, in my opinion, for Ajagba. He seems tentative in terms of letting his hands go. For a guy who's got the reach of Tyson Fury, and he's got this big, long, powerful right hand, he doesn't really let it go with real authority at the moment. It's almost as though he's concerned about being countered. And the other problem that he has is that he doesn't, in my opinion, set up his own moments. This is a guy who waits on moments. He wants to feel ultra comfortable, line you up, and then let go of a 1-2 preferably. And in the second half of the fight last night with Shaw, he did do quite well of controlling the second half of the fight with the jab. So he was doing well enough to keep Shaw tentative because Shaw himself wasn't letting go of his hands. This was a big moment for Stephen Shaw, and he seemed to let it bypass him, to be honest with you, in that second half of the fight. But the point is here, although he's capable of controlling a guy with a jab, and that can go a long way when you're fighting a guy who's not a natural boxer like a Francis Ngannou, the fact of the matter is he's still tentative to throw that right hand sometimes. And when you're talking about him being tentative against a guy like Stephen Shaw or a guy like Frank Sanchez, I assume that that would carry over against a guy like Ngannou, because whether that power carries from Ngannou into the boxing world, the fact of the matter is the aura about him, the idea of that power, and no doubt the natural heavy-handedness that he's got, is bound to make Ajagba be a little bit careful, be a little bit tentative. So could you see him against a guy like that getting a shock win? I would still back Ajagba. I think Ajagba has the right tools. I think he needs to work on a few things mentally right now. But if they work on Ngannou essentially becoming a guy that doesn't try to control the majority of the fight, he's instead looking to set up punches. And when he was working with Teddy Atlas. That's the sort of thing they were working on. Teddy was talking to him about how to lure guys in, to set traps, something Ajagba himself does not seem particularly good at right now. If they can make Ngannou into that Deontay Wilder-esque type of approach, could a guy like Ajagba, who does get touched, who is concerned about what's coming back at him, could he get caught with something? Let me know what you think. Moving on from that particular fight, we'll also ask the question about him fighting a potential guy like Jonathan Rice or Guido Vianello. Now, in terms of whether Francis Ngannou could take this level of opponent, before we get to that, let me just segue for a moment and talk briefly about this fight and a bit of controversy that was caused last night with a comment I made on Twitter, because a few people agreed with me, but the majority disagreed with me. I basically said that if I was Guido Vianello and I was stopped on this particular cut, I would have been absolutely fuming under these circumstances. And the reason was that Guido Vianello was in complete control of the fight. He came out early and established a jab early on, head, chest, keeping Jonathan Rice off balance. He was moving around the ring very, very well. He does have a tendency to rush in a little bit when he's on the outside. That transition to enter the pocket, he's not great with it, because although he's quite fast at doing it and he's athletic, he will often come inside with his head on a stick, so to speak. His chin's up in the air, not coming off the center line, and he's winging in wide shots. So that leaves him open to straight, powerful counters, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. However, despite being countered with some short, sharp jabs on occasion like that, in terms of solid, big power shots that were causing him problems, there weren't really many at all. I think one landed early on, then the other one came in the round before the fight was ended. So I think that was in the 6th round, which caused the cut. And he took it very, very well. Very flush right hand, and he took it well, but it caused this cut. Now, his eye was not bleeding as profusely as you see in some other cuts. His eyesight was not affected at all. Jonathan Rice was barely landing. So although his own defense, Rice's defense was good, he was making Vianello miss with a lot of shots, but it was the sheer activity that just meant that he was being outlanded. But despite that, he wasn't landing much of his own sort of work. So it's not like there was imminent danger there for Vianello. It's not like you're sitting there, you're thinking that eye looks terrible and Jonathan Rice is targeting it. The commentary team were talking about the fact that maybe he's saving himself for an onslaught in the latter half of the fight. That may very well have been the case. If he had adapted to start to do that and he started to target the eye and he's finding success, then I could understand why it would be stopped. But to stop it in this regard, I don't get it. And I had one person put out this tweet, which he didn't actually tag me into, but he put out this tweet which I saw, which was sort of sarcastically saying how people are trying to be braver for other fighters, and then he unfollowed me. So it was clear he was talking about me. It's not about trying to be brave for other fighters. When Dubois and Billy Joe Saunders and these sorts of guys weren't able to continue fighting, I've always said I will never call these guys quitters. I don't know what these guys are going through. There's serious injuries. So I'm not seeking to undermine Vianello. He didn't ask to be stopped. I'm saying that there's an inconsistency in what's going on here. A lot of people were saying, yeah, but Chris, he didn't complain and it's a wide cut. The reason he didn't complain is because the doctor turned to the referee in front of him and said, it's a wide cut, we need to go to the scorecards. Now, if it goes to the scorecards, Guido Vianello wins the fight. After that, it then emerges that the right decision was made. It was caused by a punch, and as a result, the victory has to go to Jonathan Rice. So he wasn't complaining in that moment, which reminds me actually of Liam Williams and Liam Smith's first fight, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if you look at certain other cuts, for instance, the Tyson Fury cut against Otto Wallin was much worse. It's a deep cut on the eyebrow. There's a cut below the eyebrow as well, just above the eye itself, which is a much more dangerous situation and position. He was allowed to fight on, and he went on to get the win. And Otto Wallin was landing a lot more consistently than Jonathan Rice was. And somebody, Showtime Boxing, shout out to him. He says he wants to come on the channel, and so many people do, and I do want to have a lot of you guys on the channel. So when I do get the lives up and running, I might do an episode where I have a few people on back to back, you know, and have an episode like that. Great guy, I love talking to him about boxing, but we often disagree, and we did disagree on this particular case. He felt that Fury, as the lineal champion, would deserve the benefit of the doubt. I don't believe you can have one rule for one and one rule for another. When it's sport, you have to apply the rules consistently. Same thing with the myth of you have to take the title off the champion. No, you don't. You have to win 7 rounds, and if you do, you've dethroned the champ, right? So if you just simply look at the extent of the cuts, Fury was allowed to continue. The Vitali situation against Lewis was different, because that is a very deep gash on the actual eyebrow itself. Then there's another laceration just above the eye, much like the Tyson Fury one, but then there's another deep cut below the eye. This is a much more different situation, and additionally to that, Lewis is landing hard, consistent power shots. Although Vitaly was winning the fight, Lewis was coming back into it. That's different. He's potentially in imminent danger with his eye. But you can't compare the Vianello situation to the Vitaly Klitschko situation. There's also the example of Michael Katsidis against Tsar Amonsat. You can see a terrible laceration on the bottom of his right eye. He's got another one on the bottom of his left eye with massive swelling, and another cut on above that eye, just below the eyebrow. Again, he was allowed to fight on. He won the fight on points. Josh Taylor, massively swollen eye, swollen shut with a laceration across the eyebrow against Regis Prograis. And that was a war. He's getting thumped by a puncher consistently. And he was allowed to carry on, and he won the fight. The Liam Williams one, you could see there are two lacerations there. One just above the eye, which is in a bad place. And then the other one just above it. But there's a very thin line of skin between the two. Otherwise, it's a diagonal cut that goes across the face of the eye. Now, that was stopped, but he was given every opportunity to carry on, and he was saying I couldn't see, because he assumed, they thought initially it was from a headbutt, and had that been the case, it would have gone to the cards and he would have won the fight. Instead, it emerged the fact that it was a punch, and Liam Smith ended up getting the victory by TKO. Had he known that it would not go to the scorecards, I really doubt that he would have retired in that moment, and that's the sort of situation we saw last night. So for me personally, I don't think that that fight should have been stopped. Now, going back to the question of Jonathan Rice and Guido Vianello versus a guy like Francis Ngannou, Vianello is a very good mover. He can maintain range. He's an Olympian. Yes, he jumps into shots, and he could potentially walk onto a right hand. So you can make a case for Francis Ngannou here. Ngannou's got those knee issues. It might have further affected his mobility, and Vianello's going to keep it long and not take any risks to not give up any dangerous opportunities. You look at someone like Jonathan Rice. He's been in with some heavy-handed guys. He's experienced. He's good at setting up that long right hand. He could potentially set up shots, and with the good defense that he has and the nice upper body movement, he might end up taking away the right hand from Ngannou, just like Stipe Miocic did the first time they fought. My point is that even these C-level guys that people are talking about, beat them first, build up, and then get to Tyson Fury, with the age that he's at, with the knee surgery that he's had and stuff like that, in my opinion, he needs to go full on Jerry Maguire and scream, show me the money. And if he can get a fight against Tyson Fury, that's the fight you need to take. If it's money you're chasing, you don't want to be fighting C-level guys, B-level guys that are a lot more experienced than you, that have been decorated amateurs and could end up toppling you. Instead, you want a shot at the big time. And with the power that you have, you are one lucky shot away from the sort of glory that would make you a legend, a UFC heavyweight champion, and then boxing heavyweight champion. That stuff dreams are made of. So for me, he has to go after somebody like Tyson Fury, or maybe even Alexander Usyk. But Fury is the big name, I think, globally speaking. In America, in at least Western Europe, that's the one you should target rather than trying to build yourself up into a boxing career. And I understand that a lot of fans out there are not interested. They want to see Fury fight Usyk. We're just talking about from the perspective of Francis Ngannou. Let me know what you think, ladies and gents, about all we've spoken about. Please don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care.